As a child, I was very accustomed to feeling travel sick as we bumped up and down on this old VW minibus, as we drove around winding country lanes on Saturday afternoon trips out. I particularly remember my grandparents' house down in Oxfordshire, and there was no M40 in those days, so we had to go through Stratford and on various very windy A roads around corners, and I was always feeling travel sick. It was horrible. Now, the truth is that quite apart from that problem, I never particularly liked journeys anyway, because I was a creature of habit. I liked my home comforts. I liked holidays up to a point, but I always enjoyed the journey home. I liked to get back into my own bedroom and my own familiarity, my own home comforts. And so, whether it was travel sickness or homesickness, maybe a combination of both, I enjoyed being home. And Psalm 84 presents us with a man who was homesick. He is a man who knew the pull of home. Now, we don't know when this psalm was written. We don't know the exact circumstances. The inscription at the top says, "of the sons of Korah." Now, if you remember, Korah was a Levite. He was a privileged man, and yet he was also an infamous figure, because he rebelled against Moses along with 250 others, and he was destroyed by God along with those men. But God was gracious. The line wasn't cursed. The line of Korah wasn't destroyed. And from his descendants came the prophet Samuel, and also a line of musicians who served in the tabernacle, initially under King David, and then we would believe for many, many years afterwards, and they would lead worship. And 11 of the Psalms are attributed to these sons of Korah. So whoever wrote this particular psalm, he was a man accustomed to being at the sanctuary, at the centre of thanksgiving and worship, at the place where God's special presence dwelt. And the implication of verse 2 is that for some unknown reason he's away from the sanctuary. It may be a temporary thing, it may be permanent, we don't know. Verse 5 certainly speaks of pilgrimage. Every year Jews from across the Promised Land would have made pilgrimages up to the Jerusalem temple for the Passover or for others of the great festivals. For whatever reason, whether it's business or it's personal, even perhaps war, we don't know. But this man of privilege, once at the centre of temple life, is now a pilgrim, like other ordinary men and women. He's an exile, he's on the open road, and he longs for home. He's homesick, and we see it in verse 2. My soul yearns, even faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Now, the thing to notice there straight away is that he's not pining for the building. If this was the time of Solomon's temple, well, then we're talking about a hugely impressive superstructure, one of the wonders of the world in its day. One of the reasons why the Queen of Sheba was willing to travel so far to visit Solomon was, I'm sure, the temple, the pride and joy of Jerusalem. But that's not what the psalmist is on about. It's not about the building. It's about the Lord of the building. The living God is the subject of this man's longing. In verse 3, he thinks of the most common of birds, sparrows, swallows. The temple courtyard was open to the elements, and the temple eaves would have been good places for these very common birds to nest, safe and secure up in the eaves where they could raise their young. And the psalmist envies these birds because the way he sees it, they are in the temple of the living God. They're close to the altar where the sacrifices are made, and that's exactly where he wants to be. And he's not there, and it grieves him, and he's homesick. And it's worth saying as well that we're not talking about a sentimental, mushy kind of love. Verse 2 actually speaks of the man's appetites. A starving man in the desert might say, "Oh, my heart and my flesh cry out for food and for sustenance," because food is so absolutely vital and central to their existence. You can't live without it. So this son of Korah is in effect saying, God is so absolutely central and vital to my existence that I can't live without him. And that's the central theme of Psalm 84. This man is homesick. He pines for his God. He experiences the pull of home, the place where God is. And yet the remarkable thing is, he's not depressed and he's not bitter, because even in exile he knows joy. Just have a look. There were 3 blesseds scattered throughout the psalm, verses 4, 5 and 12. And it's a word which basically means happy, truly happy. Verse 4, blessed are those who dwell in your house. Verse 5, blessed are those whose strength is in you. Verse 12, blessed is the man who trusts in you. This man is a true Jew. He has a circumcised heart. He knows that true happiness and blessing don't come from stuff, but from relationship, friendship with the covenant God, from dwelling with God in obedience and walking in faith with that God. And that's what he's doing. Even though he's in exile, he's walking with God, and that's why each blessed is present tense. Did you notice that? And it tells us that the pilgrim in exile may still know joy, even though he's away from home. Even though he's longing for God and he wishes he was at the sanctuary and he's longing for him, he still considers himself blessed and he still can experience joy. Now, let's just put ourselves for a moment in the place of the psalmist who's away from the sanctuary. As Christians, we're pilgrims. It's an oft-used illustration, isn't it, that we're journeying through the wilderness of this life, and we're journeying to the awesome glory of where God lives in the new heavens and earth. That's where God will be one day, and we're journeying to that point. And at the moment, we don't see him physically. We're exiles, aren't we? Living in this strange interim period between Christ's first coming and his second coming. We're in the now and the not yet. We're saved, we're justified, but we're not yet glorified. We've got Christ in our hearts, but we don't have him in our midst physically. So we live in the meantime. And we're travelling through the meantime of time and space in this world. Heaven awaits us, but it's distant. And the things of this world seem brighter at times, and the things to come seem faded and not real. Now, sometimes we can feel a bit homesick, and we're pine for heaven, and we long for the embrace of the Lord, and we wish we were there. Sometimes, though, it's very different, isn't it? Exile can embitter us, and it can cause us to despair, and we feel very depressed. It's as if our Christianity is entirely future, and there doesn't seem to be any connection with the present. Sometimes exile tempts us to do what Old Testament Lot did, which was to try and fit in the world, because after all, nobody likes feeling ill at ease. And so we're tempted to scramble to accommodate the world and to seek after temporary pleasure and to try and fit in now. Perhaps we've felt each of those different feelings in different seasons of our lives. It's difficult being in exile. And here's the thing, into those different flashpoints, the devil whispers. And one of the devil's strategies is to disconnect the Christian life from the life giver. He might say something a bit like this: look, the Christian life isn't really about God, it's just about one thing. All you need to do is avoid going to hell and make sure you get into heaven. That's all there is. And God himself and God's things and the things that God values, that can be quite boring. It can be drudgery at times, a joyless duty. It's all about rule keeping, isn't it? Denying yourself so you can get to heaven. And I recognise it's necessary, but it's very dull and it's very difficult. And I can see that you're struggling. So I'm going to offer you something. I'm going to offer you some good stuff now. In the meantime, I'm going to help you to fit in this world. Just lend me your heart and your affections now. And I'll entertain you. I'll encourage you. I'll help you on your way. Don't worry too much about God. As long as you're going to heaven, that's all that really matters. Now, it may not be quite like that, but I think we are all tempted to focus on the gifts that God gives and not on the gift giver himself. to focus on heaven but not on the God of heaven. And the thing is that heaven is only great because God is in heaven. The supreme joy of heaven is being with God. And here's the thing, right now, through his indwelling spirit and through his word and through fellowship with one another, we have fellowship with that God. Although he may seem distant, we can have fellowship with him today. And the writer of Psalm 84 knew this. And the writer of Psalm 84 speaks against the lies of Satan. And he says, look, to know the Lord today is the cause of joy. Do not think that joy is something that is exclusively for heaven and you can't enjoy now and God's boring. It's all about just getting to heaven. No. To know the Lord today is the cause of great joy. And the more we seek after him today, the more we will know that joy. The less, of course, that we seek after him, the less we'll see him. And the less we see him, well, the less joy we'll know. So I think Psalm 84 is a challenge to us. If home really is where the heart is, well, is our heart to be with the Lord who lives in our heavenly home? Or is our heart divided? But this is also a very encouraging psalm, which is what I want to focus on tonight. And Psalm 84 gives us some practical help. We're exiles, we're pilgrims, the journey's hard, and the destination does at times seem rather distant. But in such times, there are two great encouragements in this psalm for us. Here's the first. God gives us strength in our weakness. Now, on any long journey that Lucy and I undertake, my oldest son sits in the car and after about 5 minutes says, are we nearly there yet? I'm bored. When are we there? And he's trying not to listen to me. Now, I have to sympathise because 2 hours is a long time, isn't it, when you're 7 years old? And there isn't a lot to do in the car. And Mummy and Daddy are at the front talking away to themselves. So his mind is entirely on the length of the journey, and it's depressing. Now, how much more so for every Jewish pilgrim in those days who passed through something that in verse 6, the psalmist calls the Valley of Baca. Now, Baca is a word that comes from a balsam tree, and balsam trees were trees or shrubs that particularly flourished in dry, arid places. And the psalmist is possibly referring to a stretch of the pilgrim route up towards Jerusalem, a dry, waterless valley lined with these cheerless shrubs, not particularly pretty, and there's no water and there's no refreshment, a hard place to journey through, particularly if you've already been on the road a long time. And you can imagine strength being drained, people losing heart at that point, and the faithless man or woman would have thought, oh, that's it. It would have been a veil of tears and they would have given up. But the psalmist says, blessed are those whose strength is in you, who have set their hearts on pilgrimage. As they pass through the valley of Baca, they make it a place of springs. The autumn rains also cover it with pools. They go from strength to strength, till each appears before God in Zion. The psalmist is saying that the weary pilgrim mind isn't focused on his lack, on his thirst and his sore feet, his tiredness. Yes, he's weak and he knows he's weak, but his very weakness has prevented him from depending on any natural resources. The dry valley around prevents him from depending on water nearby. And so instead, in faith, he leans on God and he looks to God. And something remarkable happens, that faith, as it were, transforms the dead valley. In his mind's eye, it suddenly becomes a place of great encouragement, a place of springs and cool, refreshing water. And hope is stirred and strength is renewed, and he strides forward with greater pace, and he goes from strength to strength. And people watching wouldn't believe it. He suddenly seems to have more energy at the end than he did at the beginning. Now, in the same way, God has imposed weaknesses of various kinds on each of us as Christian pilgrims, whether it's a circumstantial trial, which we have to pass through, or perhaps a personal trial that we have to live with. We've got a New Testament example, haven't we, in the Apostle Paul. Do you remember in 2 Corinthians how Paul received from Satan, but ultimately from the Lord, a thorn in the flesh? It wasn't something sinful, it wasn't immorality, it wasn't a judgment upon his sin, but some kind of natural underlying problem. We don't know what it was. It could have been physical, it could have been emotional or psychological. We don't know. But it was pretty bad because Paul was a tough, stoical man, a man of strong faith, and he really, really struggled so much that he pleaded with the Lord for it to be removed 3 times, or we might say 3 seasons, 3 periods of prolonged time. He pleaded with the Lord, remove it, and each time the answer was no. But God gave a special word to Paul. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So this exhausting thorn, which tormented Paul and sapped his strength, was possibly known about by his opponents, and it was used by them to deride him and belittle him. It was actually a divine opportunity for the manifestation of Christ's power, because Paul was just not going to be able to depend on his usual natural resources, of which he had plenty, but he couldn't. And he had no option and no temptation to look anywhere else but look to God. And as he did in his utter weakness, in grace, God would give Paul the strength to endure the pain, even to rejoice in the pain. And as he did, Jesus would be glorified and Jesus' power would be made evident. Because as people looked at Paul, small Paul, struggling on through the pain, and they could see no human source for the strength, as they looked at this struggling man, and they saw nothing humanly speaking that commended him for apostleship, they were forced to acknowledge that there had to be something else at play, that Christ was at work, that Paul's God was there sustaining Paul. Besetting weaknesses given to God glorify Christ. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? It's contrary to human wisdom. But when we are in the valley of Baca, and we will be at different times, we may always be there. That may be the path that God has called us to walk. But when we're there and weakness has emptied us of self and all we can do is turn to God, his power is made perfect and we will be given the strength to continue in him. We will go from strength to strength. Or as Paul said in 2 Corinthians 3, we're transformed into Christ's likeness with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord. And that is blessing, that is true happiness, to come to the end of yourself, to reach the end of the road, to know that you personally have no strength to carry on, and in dependence and faith to look to God, to pour it out before him, to walk with him and trust him, and to be infused by the power of Almighty God to continue. That's blessing, that's happiness, a happiness that comes directly from the Lord. It's far better to be weak and to know you're weak and to be turned upwards to God than to be self-sufficient and proud and inward looking, and therefore the pressure's all on you. And you are prey to the wiles of the devil and the flesh and the world. So that's one little encouragement that we have on our pilgrimage as exiles, that we may know strength in weakness. And secondly, not only does God do that for us, but God gives us pleasure with little. Now, pilgrim life in ancient times would have been hard. Poor quality roads that were very hard on the feet. No place to stay at night. You were open to the elements. You would have been vulnerable to bandits and wild animals. And of course, the most basic thing of all, it took time. Journeying anywhere took time. And the psalmist, wherever he's come from, however long he's been on the road, he has all that to contend with. And all the time he feels homesick, away from the place he loved. So life wasn't good. And yet verse 10, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. For the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord bestows favour and honour. No good thing does he withhold from those whose walk is blameless. So we might think, well, there'll be a string of complaints and moans from the psalmist here, and he's going to say, woe is me, and it's quite the opposite. It's an upward focus, isn't it? And it represents a beautiful attitude of heart and mind. Absence from home doesn't embitter the psalmist. Absence makes his heart grow fonder, and that's often the way, isn't it? Derek Kinder writes that it's the exile who appreciates home, while the stay-at-homes often find fault with it. And I can certainly say that's very true. You get really annoyed with your house, don't you, all the things that go wrong. But when you've been on holiday for a couple of weeks, you come back and there's no place like home. Now, the psalmist is in exile. He's away from home, and we don't know for sure if he knows whether he's going to get back there anytime soon. And he's got nothing to go on but tiredness and weariness. He has, though, these memories of what home was like. Memories of the blessing of being with the Lord, being in the sanctuary with God. And he's not focused on his lack. And he's not grasping over, having more than he used to have. I hope when I get back I'm going to be rewarded with this and that, and the Lord will do this and that. He's a man of contentment. He's content with his lot. He knew that he'd been a man of privilege, who'd served the Lord at his house. If Aladdin's genie of the lamp had suddenly anachronistically appeared and offered him his own fortified city, or perhaps all the kingdoms of the world in his sway, this man would have said no. And if Satan had appeared and said, you know what, I'm going to take away all your tiredness and all your weariness, and I'll wash your feet, I'll give you a place to stay and a 3-course meal, if only you'll just give up on God and forget him and worship me, he'd have said no. To even know God was a joy, and to have been in even the outer courts at that temple was far better than to be in the throne room of any earthly kingdom. And to just reflect in his heart that he had served the Lord in his tabernacle, that was better than any prospective offer of riches to come. And it's about the right perspective, and it's ultimately about contentment. It's about the joy of knowing God. He's described as a sun and a shield. The life-giving warmth and vitality of the sun is like knowing the Lord who created the sun. And the sure protection and security of a shield, a sturdy shield, it's the same as resting in the God who loves us and keeps us, as we thought this morning. And even in the valley of Baca, even in the vale of tears, this man is able to weigh up loss against gain, the loss of his house and his sort of freedom and his comfort against the gain of knowing God. And the scales tip heavily in God's favour. The sweet outweighs the bitter. It's the Old Testament echo of what Paul says famously in Philippians 3. Whatever was to my profit, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. And what is more, I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. Contentment. True joy in the Lord. Now there's another well-known passage that speaks of contentment, isn't there? 1 Timothy 6, and it says famously, godliness with contentment is great gain. But we sometimes forget what carries on after that because it's a sobering warning. Paul says, people who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root, I get the quote right, of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. You see, the hardness of pilgrim life in this world will tempt us, not initially perhaps to give up completely, but to stop for a breather. You know, the equivalent of stopping at the service station and spending a night at the Premier Inn, where Lenny Henry lives. I just need to recharge my batteries. I've given a lot to the Lord, and I need to just get away and have some me time for a bit. And yet many professing believers, disillusioned with the cost of pilgrim life, stop for a break and they never return to the road. That's the warning. And yet Spurgeon, a man who knew what it was to stay the course, he said that God's worst is better than the devil's best. And that's really true. God's worst, if we can call it that, is better by far than the devil's best. And if we are willing to endure weakness so that Christ's power is made manifest in us and through us, and if we're able to take pleasure in the little that God gives us, and if we, through the eyes of faith, realise that knowing him is better than anything else, well, verse 11, a wonderful promise, the Lord bestows favour and honour. No good thing does he withhold from those whose walk is blameless. Now, I appreciate that's the kind of verse that can easily be twisted by the word of faith, health, wealth and prosperity people, the Benny Hinn and all those. But just as Romans 8, when it says that God works all things for the good of those who love him, is not specific about that good, so this psalm doesn't specify the good, does it? People try and fill in the blanks, but good may not be health and wealth and prosperity in this life. But good will include increasing joy in the presence of God, an increasing understanding of his grace and his love for us and his truth. And we know for sure that good will ultimately mean eternal treasure in glory. And whatever it may or may not mean, well, faith doesn't quibble, because faith lays hold of the Lord, who is more good than any good, because he's the epitome of goodness. He's the bright sun, isn't he? He's the shield, and he alone satisfies. It's no wonder that, armed with this promise, the psalmist ends with this lovely reflection: blessed, happy, truly joyful is the man who trusts in you. That's how he ends, and who can argue with him? And as it ends, we don't know how it ends for that psalmist, do we? We don't know whether he ever returned to the sanctuary, whether he spent his final years as an exile. We don't know. But we do know that his heart's desire was met, because he's with the Lord today in heaven. It's a challenge, isn't it, I think, this psalm for us, when you're confronted with that kind of fervour and love. My soul faints for you. It's a challenge, because sometimes you think, I don't faint for the Lord, and I'm not sure I always feel like that. And perhaps we should. The Lord wants us. He wants our undivided hearts. As we considered in Jude this morning, we're kept for Christ because we're his bride, we're his people. We've been saved for him. And he wants us. He wants our affections. He withholds nothing from us. The question is, are we withholding our love from him? Is our heart a bit divided? Are we too focused at times on temporary pleasures? The psalmist, I think, is a challenging example to us of a man who really did have his priorities right, who longed for God and wanted nothing more than to be with God. If home really is where the heart is, well, where is our heart? Is our heart to be with the Lord? But we can be encouraged as well that if we are, and we are imperfect, aren't we? But if we are, however imperfectly, focused upon him, living by faith, and we do wish we could be with him and we long to know him better, be encouraged. Because even in those valleys of dryness and faintness, he will be there with you. He will strengthen you in your weakness. He will manifest his glory in your weakness. And he will give you pleasure with a little, until the day comes when your joy is complete and you have a lot more, because you will be with him in glory and you will see him face to face. And that's, I trust, where we're all headed for tonight, for glory in heaven with the Lord. Amen. Amen.